So if we're thinking about the whole Old Testament, Genesis to Kings is the main story of the Old Testament, the backbone of the story. From creation to exile. The prophetic books, the prophetic literature gives God's commentary, his thoughts, his insight, his perspective on that main story from Genesis to Kings. But what about the other books? Books like Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, these kind of books. What we often call like wisdom and poetry. What do they do with the story? These books, again, like the prophetic literature, do not really carry the story forward at all, maybe even less than the prophetic books. Like you read the book of Proverbs, for example, and other than it being connected to Solomon, we probably would have no idea when it was written. Or any idea of what was going on in the history of that time period. That's not the point of Proverbs. It's doing something different. Well, what is it doing? What is Job doing? It's not Job. You don't read Job and learn something new about the story per se, or carry it forward by any means from where the book of Kings ends. That's not what's going on in Job. But what is happening? Because Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, these books are doing something. What are they doing? So again, I would say Genesis to Kings, the main story. The prophetic literature, God's commentary on the story. The wisdom and poetry is adding perspective on life within the story. Like, what was the life of the people of God supposed to be like? How were they supposed to live well in God's place as God's people under God's rule? How has God orchestrated life? What is his perspective on the different facets of life? How do we handle confusion in life and suffering in life? What does God want from his people on the day-to-day, in their relationships with each other, in their work, in their worship? These books add perspective on life within the story. They don't really tell the story or carry the story forward, but they help you see the characters and the life of the people in the story better and get better clarity in your own mind about what God might want from your life in the story, because we're all part of this story too. Now, let's just take some of these books then. So you got the Song of Solomon. You read the Song of Solomon and you might be like, what is this? Why is this in the Bible? This doesn't seem like a book that you would expect to be in the Bible because it's primarily about sex. What's the point of this book being in the Bible? Well, it's adding perspective on the life of the people within God's story. And sex is a big part of the life of God's people in the story. This is something that God cares about. Sex is a gift from God, something he made, something he thought of that is good, that he gave as a good gift for his people. And the Song of Solomon is largely a celebration of the beauty and the purity and the pleasure of the sexual relationships that God has made for a man and a woman to experience together within the confines of marriage. It's a beautiful picture. And then when you think back to the story in light of the Song of Solomon, we realize, wow, this has been one of the greatest areas of failure for God's people throughout the story of the Old Testament, from the garden onward, right? It's hard to even recount the stories. How many stories there are of horrible failures sexually. We could think of the rape of Dinah, daughter of Jacob. We could think of Judah and Tamar. We could think of Amnon raping his half-sister Tamar. We could think of David committing adultery with the wife of Uriah. We could think of Sodom and Gomorrah, the horrible scenes there, the end of Judges, the horrible scenes there. We could think of the prevalence of male prostitution among the people of Israel and Judah in the worship of false gods. And then, we're thinking about the Song of Solomon. Someone who warns against sexual sin in the book of Proverbs. Somebody who celebrates the gift of the sexual relationship and has God's mind on it in the Song of Solomon. And yet, where was his downfall? So much of it was connected to his lack of a sexual ethic, right? to his chasing after all of these foreign wives, entangling himself in sexual relationships and marriages and alliances with all these women who turned his heart away from the Lord, and it was his downfall. What about other books? Like Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, these other books that we look at as wisdom books. And I'd love to talk more about these things, but because this class is focused on the story of Scripture, I'm just touching on these to help you learn how to read them better. Like, you read the book of Proverbs, and what do you find in the book of Proverbs? You know, some of this is coming from a friend of mine, Jeremy Farmer. Some of this is just like a big picture of how Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes might relate to each other. It's maybe a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's helpful. I think the book of Proverbs basically tells you how to live life well here, what you can expect under God's rule. This is the kind of things that God blesses. These are the kinds of things that God hates. This is how to live and experience God's blessing in God's places, God's people. This is the normal way that life works. If you fear the Lord and you seek after Him with your whole heart, there'll be blessing for you. If you run from Him, there'll be curses awaiting you. If you surround yourself with good counsel and good friends, things will go well for you. If you surround yourself with sinners and people who don't fear the Lord and who are foolish, you too will experience the same kind of things that are in store for them. This is the kind of thing that you read in the book of Proverbs. But then you read a book like Job, and if you think of it in relation to Proverbs, it's like Proverbs is basically, if you obey God and seek Him first and do things that are wise, then you can get blessed. You can experience a good life here. But then you read Job, and it kind of gives a clarification, or there's more to this than just what you read in Proverbs, right? Because you read Job, and here's this guy Job who fears the Lord and obeys the Lord and puts the Lord first, like Proverbs commends, and yet what does he get in his life? He doesn't get the blessings that Proverbs seems to say you should expect. He gets suffering, and so then his friends come and they're like, you're getting bad things in your life, therefore you must be doing bad things, or you must be hiding bad things. And we realize from the story of Job, you can't just assume that if you do what's right, you'll get blessed. It's not that easy in this world. You might do what's right and get suffering. But even if that happens, you need to keep trusting in the Lord, because God's plans and His wisdom is bigger than ours. You trust God and fear Him even if it doesn't go well for you, because obeying God isn't just about expecting to get blessing. Obeying God is about God. It's because we fear and love God and we trust Him no matter what happens. Proverbs tells us this is what will normally happen, but Job clarifies this. This isn't what always will happen. You might be the most righteous man in your whole area, fearing the Lord and doing what is right, and life may end up with lots of suffering. And don't ever look at somebody and think because they're suffering, they must have sinned or be hiding something. That's not the way it always is in God's world, in this fallen world, where sin has tainted everything. God often has things going on that are far beyond what we would expect. And you read about that in Job, about what God is doing even with Satan, showing how Job is faithful even if God withholds the blessings as a testimony to Satan. You can read about it in the book of Job. But then you got a book like Ecclesiastes, and it gives another perspective here. We think in Proverbs, if we obey, we'll get blessing. Job's kind of clarifies, but you might get suffering even if you are obedient. But Ecclesiastes, you find Solomon chasing after all the things that this world has to offer. He gets all of the good life, and it turns out it's not satisfying. And you could have everything about the good life and not be satisfied at all. You could have all the blessings of money and friendship and sexual pleasure and all of these things and be completely empty unless you fear the Lord first and keep His commandments. having all the things of the good life will never satisfy you. You learn that from Ecclesiastes. Getting the things that Proverbs might hold out for you is not the object. And in fact, they'll be unsatisfying unless your heart is submitted to the Lord. And then you also find out from Ecclesiastes that this life has lots of confusing things in it. You're not always going to be able to figure everything out. There's always going to be frustrations, always mysteries, always enigmas, as my friend Phil likes to say. Frustrating enigmas about life, things we can't get our minds around, of why a good person gets bad things and a bad person seems to get good things. But at the end of the day, we fear God. We keep His commandments, and we enjoy the life that God has given us. We enjoy the work He's given us, the relationships He's given us, and we keep in mind that one day God's going to bring into account everything we've done. All of these things together, the Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, what do? They add perspective. They fill out the details of how best to live life within God's story.